Hello and welcome everybody, Scotty here from azoffroad.net. And before we get started today, I just want to take a quick sec and say a very special thank you this Veterans Day weekend. So thank you to all of those who have served in our armed forces, those who are continuing to serve, and those who have had family serve as well. So special thank you this weekend, and in honor of it being Veterans Day this weekend, I wanted to do something that was military themed, but I also still wanted to do something where I could bring the Jeep along and do a little bit of exploring. And I think I have found the perfect combination out here in Buckeye, Arizona to do a very unique military themed off-road special. So right now I am currently standing on what used to be the active runway here at Luke Auxiliary Airfield number 6. And we parked the Jeep here on this long stretch of dirt road, and today's video will be all about exploring what's left of this awesome ruin right here in Buckeye, AZ. So before World War II, there were several airfields around Arizona. Luke Air Force Base was just being built, 1940, 1941. But as the war turned on, as the countries entered in, and eventually the United States entered in, they popped up pretty much everywhere across the southwestern third of Arizona. So you had a lot of other air bases pop up around Arizona. Williams Field, Davis-Monthan, Luke Field, Gila Bend, Yuma are just some of the many that were scattered across the state. So each independent airfield had its own auxiliary airfield, and that's what this is. This is an auxiliary airfield, number 6 to be specific. So for Luke Air Force Base, at the time I believe it was actually called the Litchfield Air Base, or Army Air Base at the time because the Air Force wasn't around yet. But there were 8 for Luke, so they were all scattered around the white tanks, kind of around where Luke airplanes would be flying. So this was just one of many airfields that had ties to Luke. Of course, there were many other air bases around, each of them with their own auxiliary airfields. A lot of airfields popped up fresh. They were new. They were created solely for the war effort. And then several airfields were also converted from civilian use to a military base, Davis-Monthan being one of those. So it was a very active time in Arizona. Arizona, of course, is naturally very sunny, very clear, very good weather, not a lot of snow, and its position close to California meant that it was a pretty good defensive stronghold. Alright, so we have pretty much cruised down the entire length of the east-west runway, which is, that way is east, looking down the way we came, and we are turning on to the kind of northeast-southwest runway. So as we head east, we'll get into a little bit more of the history of this base in particular. Now, it was built in 1943, so a couple years after Luke Air Force Base had opened, after the Barry Goldwater Air Force bombing range had opened, which we actually went down there. We passed through on our El Camino trip a year ago, if you haven't seen that. Very interesting trip through very sparsely populated country. So anyways, back to this airfield. Jets were flying between here and the bombing range down by the Mexico border, and auxiliary airfields like this were used for when something went wrong, or also during other training missions. So this airfield in particular was actually one of the busiest and most popular of the Luke auxiliary fields. They had quite a setup here going on. In fact, it cost $200,000 to build this property, which sits on roughly 1,000 acres. So we are currently aimed down the southwest and northeast facing runway here at the north end of the field, and there is still a lot intact. In fact, there is still paint left on the ground here, which is very cool. This is probably the best preserved part of the airstrip. Now, originally the configuration of this airfield was that it had 2 4,000 by 300 foot runways, and those runways were this one that we are currently sitting on, and then the south facing one that we started on. This east facing one originally was a taxiway. That's where all the parking ramp and the buildings were. We'll get to that in a little bit, but that was later paved as well, and that became a runway. So during its operational time, it had 3 4,000 foot by 300 foot runways for use. which allowed them to land regardless of wind direction. So later on, this runway that we are currently sitting on was actually extended about another 1,000 feet. And actually, of the 8 airfields that exist, or that existed during World War II, this was one of the busiest. There was 2 that were very busy, very active throughout the war, and this was one of them, the Goodyear Field. So they had a little bit more than like your average airfield. They had buildings for crew chiefs, they had operations buildings, supplies, barracks, a crash truck shed, generators, and it's said that this actually even had an air traffic control tower. However, a lot of the original pictures of the area don't show that, so not sure on that one, but it definitely was a substantial airfield, probably because this was one of the closest to Luke itself. So after the jets would take off from Luke and they encountered any problems, this was probably the first place they turned to. Also the fact that Barry Goldwater Air Force Range is down south, so this even today remains a very active military jetway. So during World War II and the training that happened during that period of time, I imagine much of the same. So this was a very critical airfield to the history of Luke Air Force Base and the training that went on here. So somebody has made a makeshift little racetrack out here on one of the runways. We are now cruising down the northwest southeast runway. Pretty much just more of the same. We're about to get up here to the parking apron where the buildings are, or where they used to be. So we'll check that out, and then that'll pretty much be about it for Goodyear Field. Out here on the edge of the apron now, and this is where whatever buildings would be standing on property would have been. That's all that is left. Just a few cement pads, and that's it. That's all that is remaining here at the Goodyear Field. And we're actually really close to this road right now. It is a WWII, and most of these people probably have no idea. They probably just think I'm out here crazy talking to myself. They don't realize what a cool history lesson is lying here on the desert floor. So gonna head back to the Jeep, and then that'll be about it. When you get down here to the southwestern end of the field, you see these giant letters painted on the ground, which from down here they don't really seem to be very significant. But once you get up in the air, you can see that they actually say L280. Now, this was not part of the original airfield during World War II and when the Air Force used it, but it actually stands for a training crew from Lufthansa Airways. Now, Lufthansa is currently training out of Goodyear Airport nearby, and they must have used this field in some sort of connection with their training after it closed and was released from the Air Force's hands. So the Army Corps of Engineers declared the airfield excess in 1957, and then sometime between 1960 and 1970 is when it really shut down. And it must have been after this point that the Lufthansa crew came in, either used the airfield or visited it, and they left their mark here, which remains to this day on the pavement. So anyways, that is about it here at Luke Auxiliary Airfield number 6, better known as Goodyear Field. But it was fun to take a spin around the airfield, see a little bit of the taxiways left, see some of the numbering left on the ground, and see the foundations of the buildings that used to stand here, all while those Luke jets are still flying way over my head. I hope this video was interesting, hopefully delved into a little bit of the unknown history of the area and a little bit of a tribute to Veterans Day this weekend. So I believe there's only one real way to sign off here, and that is for a nice final cruise down the runway. So I'm going to sign off right now, go do that, and we will see you guys on the next adventure. Thanks for watching.